Hey Slate listeners, I'm Christina Cauterucci, the host of Slowburn, Gays Against Briggs. I want to tell you about a special event we're doing at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York City on June 13th. To celebrate this new season of Slowburn and Pride Month, we're hosting an exclusive live taping of the show with special guests, including civil rights activist and Black Lives Matter organizer DeRay McKesson, comedian and singer Esther Fallick, Eric Marcus, the host of Making Gay History, and Sam Fader, director of the Netflix documentary Disclosure, about the depiction of trans people in film and television. We'll dive deeper into this season and talk about the lasting impact of the Briggs Initiative and the continued fight over LGBTQ rights in schools. It'll be the perfect way to celebrate Pride Month this June with LGBTQ stories and voices across generations. Again, that's June 13th at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York. You can get tickets now at tribecafilm.com/slowburn. Hope to see you there.
If there's one complaint we've heard over and over about the 2024 presidential election, it's that it's more of the same. Same Biden, same Trump, same positions, give or take an overseas war or a criminal conviction. But when you look back to the 2020 race, there's one pretty major difference.
I would, in fact, make sure that we immediately surge to the border. All those people are seeking asylum. They deserve to be heard. That's who we are.
That's candidate Joe Biden speaking during an ABC Democratic debate. And this wasn't a one-off comment. Biden brought up immigration a lot in 2019. In town halls.
On day one, I'm going to send the legislative immigration reform bill to Congress to provide a roadmap to citizenship for 11 million undocumented immigrants who contribute so much to this country, including one.
At rallies.
We could afford to take in a heartbeat another 2 million people. The idea that a country of 330 million people cannot absorb people who are in desperate need and who are justifiably fleeing oppression is absolutely bizarre.
And yes, during the debates.
We're a nation that says if you want to flee and you're fleeing oppression, you should come. I would change.
Which was why it was so shocking to hear the president speak last Tuesday.
Today, I'm announcing actions to bar migrants who cross our southern border unlawfully from receiving asylum. Migrants.
What was so striking to hear in his speech was the fact that here he was trying to reassert how tough he wanted to be at the southern border.
That's Jonathan Blitzer. He's a staff writer at The New Yorker.
But then that, of course, raised the question of, okay, well, how do you differentiate yourself from someone like Trump?
Last week, Biden announced an executive order that would severely limit migrants from seeking asylum at the border. The policy kicks in once the 7-day average for daily illegal crossings hits 2,500 people.
In 5 of the last 6 years, the daily average every month has been over 2,500 every single month in the last, in 5 of the last 6 years, except for 1, which is just to say that, the idea here is that even relatively low levels of daily crossings in between ports of entry are too much for the government to want to deal with.
Now, during his 2020 campaign, Biden said that the United States could absorb 2 million immigrants at the border. So what changed?
I think the politics changed, for one thing, relatively soon out of the gate in the Biden administration. There was a real sense of panic and anxiety that the numbers of people arriving at the southern border seeking asylum were high, that there was no easy way to deal with those numbers. And frankly, there isn't. It's a very complicated policy problem. But the politics were so bruising that Republicans had this easy attack line. And so I think for most of Biden's presidency, he's been on his back foot. I think this should be seen as a kind of 180 from the identity he built for himself on the 2020 campaign trail. I mean, the idea that he would, want to make a show of how he is, curtailing asylum at the southern border, the fact that he would even lapse into language like "I'm shutting down the border," is a significant departure.
Today on the show, does Biden actually have a border problem? I'm Mary C. Curtis, in for Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
It's hard to imagine a world where we leave future generations with fewer rights and freedoms. The Supreme Court has stolen the constitutional right to control our bodies. Now, politicians in nearly every state have introduced bills that would block people from getting the essential sexual and reproductive care they need, including abortion. Planned Parenthood believes everyone deserves access to care. It's a human right. We won't give up, and we won't back down. Help ensure the next generation can decide their own futures. Donate to Planned Parenthood. Visit plannedparenthood.org/future.
This episode is brought to you by Discover. When it comes to your finances, Discover wants you to know they are the credit card that is always there for you. With 24/7 U.S.-based live customer service, everyone has the option to talk to a real person anytime, day or night. Yep, that means no more waiting for, quote, normal business hours just to get a hold of someone. We are talking real service from real people whenever you need it. Get the customer service you deserve with Discover. Limitations apply. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
The New York Times has called this the most restrictive immigration policy issued by Biden or any modern Democrat. So just how unusual is this executive order? Because I remember that some folks called Obama the deporter-in-chief. Is this really the most restrictive?
Well, when people say this is the most restrictive sort of asylum policy from a Democrat in years, it's not an exaggeration, because the whole theory of the case of the administration on this is it wants to direct people to ports of entry where there are government officials who can process people's claims and make things more orderly. The problem for them is that the way the asylum statute is written, and the way the law is supposed to work, is that anyone in need of protection is supposed to be able to make a claim wherever they enter the United States, whether it's at a port of entry or not. And what this executive order does is it basically shuts down that avenue for people who are crossing in between ports of entry, which is to say, huge numbers of people now will not be able to avail themselves of a basic legal right. That's significant.
So let's do some quick Asylum 101. Say I'm in Honduras and I'm seeking asylum. What do I do? What is the U.S. legally required to provide for asylum seekers, whether they come here legally or illegally? Who's allowed to ask for asylum, and what boxes do you have to check?
Anyone who arrives at the U.S. southern border is legally entitled to seek asylum, which is to say, to ask for protection based on persecution, based on a claim that they're being persecuted in their home country. What's supposed to happen is when you make that asylum claim at the southern border, a government agent gives you a preliminary screening. It's known as a credible fear interview. And the idea basically is we're going to establish through a kind of brief but somewhat detailed interview that the circumstances you're describing, the reason for your flight and from your home country and arrival at the southern border are related to what seemed like persecution. Therefore, you could continue along the process and eventually appear before an immigration judge who will hear your asylum claim. So that's what's supposed to happen. The problem in practice is the system is so backlogged and there are all sorts of bureaucratic snafus and delays that people show up at the southern border and oftentimes go through their initial credible fear hearing, this initial screening, but then don't have an actual court date to appear before an immigration judge who will actually weigh the merits of the full asylum claim for, in some cases, several years. And so, what starts to happen is claiming asylum starts to increasingly become synonymous with entering the country.
How often is asylum actually granted?
Well, it varies depending on which judge you appear before and which state that judge works in. And so if you're having your asylum hearing in El Paso, Texas, I think, I haven't looked at these numbers recently, but for a time, the rejection rate of asylum claims by the immigration judges in that district was around 90%. So you had a 10% chance of getting asylum in an immigration court in El Paso. But by contrast, if you were going through the immigration court in Chicago or in New York, you had a much higher likelihood of actually getting through. And so there's a lot of variation and a lot of kind of irregularity in how these standards are judged.
Yeah, last year, the migrant encounters at the border hit an all-time high. Do we know how many of them are actually seeking asylum? Do they all check those boxes?
Well, this is, I mean, what you're putting your finger on is the kind of real policy paradox for progressive-minded people on this issue. It's fair to say that the majority of people showing up at the southern border over the last couple of years would not qualify for asylum based on the specific language that's laid out in asylum law. That does not mean that people aren't fleeing their homes for urgent or legitimate reasons. It just means that their particular circumstances don't map cleanly onto the statute, which lays out very specific conditions for the persecution someone has to be suffering from in order to qualify for asylum. What do you do with someone whose house has been obliterated by a major storm, or who was a farmer who now can't grow food because the climate has changed? You know, that person is facing crushing existential poverty, but technically isn't being persecuted in the way that the asylum statute lays out. And so what started to happen over the last, decade plus is there has been no wider reform of the immigration system. And so, people who otherwise would have avenues to come to the United States legally, to reunite with family, to work, and so on, don't really have those opportunities because the last time the U.S. immigration system was reformed meaningfully was 1990. So the wider system is in disarray, hasn't been updated in any meaningful sense. But the border remains really people's best shot of being able to enter the country.
Why are so many people coming to the border?
So until recently, the lion's share of people showing up at the southern border seeking asylum were coming from Central America. And the reason people were leaving Central America in large numbers was everything from fleeing gang violence to feeling strangled by poverty, political corruption, generalized violence, the ravages of climate change, and so on. Moving farther south, you start to see the consequences of the pandemic and how the pandemic devastated economies in the wider region. And so, take, for example, a country like Haiti. A lot of the people who fled Haiti in 2010 when there was that massive, horrific earthquake wound up in countries like Chile in South America. Now, because of the fallout of the pandemic, economies battered by the pandemic and so on, and global inflation, you had Haitians in places like Chile getting uprooted again. And so in September of 2021, you saw this sudden spike in Haitians showing up at the U.S. southern border. Those were Haitians who had spent the last decade plus in Chile, not even in Haiti. We are at a moment right now of global mass migration that we haven't really seen since the Second World War. And one of the things that's so significant at this moment in time, too, is that the population of people showing up at the southern border is increasingly global. This is a new phenomenon. You have people from Africa, from Asia, arriving in notable numbers. And so you're really starting to see kind of the wider world convulsing and forcing people to uproot themselves and to move.
We'll be right back after the break.
This episode is brought to you by Discover. When it comes to your finances, Discover wants you to know they are the credit card that is always there for you. With 24/7 U.S.-based live customer service, everyone has the option to talk to a real person anytime, day or night. Yep, that means no more waiting for, quote, normal business hours just to get a hold of someone. We are talking real service from real people whenever you need it. Get the customer service you deserve with Discover. Limitations apply. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
McDonald's presents Burger Reviews by Hamburglar. Today's review, the hotter, juicier classic burgers. Mr. Hamburglar. Robble, robble. He said, of all the McDonald's burgers I've ever hamburgled, these are the hottest, juiciest, and tastiest. Brabble.
Hamburglary is on the rise. Get caught with a medium double cheeseburger meal for $6. Price and participation may vary. Promotion pricing may be lower than meal price. Comparison to prior classic burgers.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
I'm Mary C. Curtis, in for Mary Harris. Back in January, President Biden said he had done all he could do at the border. In February, Senate Democrats pivoted hard right and negotiated with Republicans to put together an immigration bill that resembled a conservative border wish list. I asked Jonathan how the politics of 2024 got so toxic.
You put your finger on what is exactly the tension that strained the upper ranks of the Biden White House this past winter. So, in the lead up to that Senate bill, one of the things the president said, rightly, was that the only entity that could make systemic changes to asylum practice was Congress. And so he stressed that point again and again. And the idea was to really drum up a sense of urgency and clarity on the need for Congress to act. When the Senate bill failed, the president was then in this position of not wanting to immediately step out and issue an executive order that did something similar to the Senate bill, because here he was stressing the fact that only Congress could act. And so the White House, even though it had thought very pointedly about the executive order that we just saw, or a version of the executive order that we just saw announced, they sat back for a while and tried to press their political advantage first around the fact that Republicans in Congress had demanded changes to the asylum system. Democrats gave them those changes, and then the Republicans rejected it. And one of the realities that is sort of immovable for this White House is the fact that for all of these changes in the dynamic at the southern border over the last several months, the president's poll numbers on immigration are still very low. And so there's really a sense that, okay, we have to do something.
And that bill was actually negotiated in part by Senate Republicans. Mitch McConnell was one of them. What was in it? You said it was pretty tough. And how did it end up after all that on the chopping block?
Ultimately, the Senate bill failed because Donald Trump came out against it, rallied congressional Republicans against the bill. And the rationale was very clear. And in fact, Mitch McConnell, the Senate minority leader, was explicit about it. When he spoke to members of his Senate conference, he said, look, the politics of this issue have changed. We're in the middle of a national election. Our candidate, the presumptive nominee, is campaigning specifically on the fact that there's disorder at the southern border. Why would we try to fix that situation if our candidate is benefiting from the chaos? And so just like that, this bill that had Republican input gets tossed aside.
Now, congressional Democrats have argued that failure to pass that legislation led directly to the current executive order, that basically that was the only move left to the president. Do you buy that, Jonathan?
I do and I don't. I mean, I think really the importance of the failure of that Senate bill can't be overstated. The idea that Democrats were willing to go to the lengths that they went to make changes to asylum, only for Republicans to walk away anyway, I think really does announce to everyone that there's no hope, given Republican sensibilities in Washington, to deal in any sense with this issue legislatively. As to how we get to the current executive order, the thing that strikes me is that this executive order is harsher than that Senate bill. So this is the reason why I would push back a little bit against the Democratic sentiment that you described. Now what you're seeing is a sense of political opportunity entering into the equation for the White House, and they're trying to go even farther. Now, to be honest with you, I don't totally understand what the thinking is there. Like, I don't think voters are really like taking the details of the Senate bill and laying them beside the details of this executive order and saying, wow, the president is staking out a case that's even harsher than the Senate bill. I don't think people are engaging on that level of detail. So it's striking to see the White House feel that it has that need.
Now, recent months, border crossings have actually dropped dramatically. They're down more than 50% from the record highs of late last year. What's behind that? And given the declining numbers, is this move even necessary right now?
So the reason for those declining numbers is primarily the fact that Mexico is making a lot more arrests in Mexico of migrants passing through that country than they had been before. And so, for example, the Mexican government has made 3 times more arrests this year than it did last year. This is a dynamic that's played out before. Every administration, from the Obama administration to the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, has traded on this fact that, really, at the end of the day, the Mexican government is the U.S. government's sort of best tool to control numbers at the southern border. So that's the most immediate explanation for what we've seen recently. As to whether or not that raises questions about the timing of this executive order, from a policy perspective, I've always been very wary of anyone making claims about immigration policy based solely on the border numbers. Those numbers are always going to tick down and tick back up. And unless you're dealing with kind of some of the deep underlying causes that are forcing people to up and leave their homes, there may be momentary or periodic shifts in those numbers, but there's always going to be this baseline reality of people showing up at the southern border. And so if your political strategy is staked entirely on being able to tout lower numbers, you're in for a wild ride because you cannot control what's going on in the wider world. That said, if the Biden administration is fighting for its political life, as it clearly is, and if the Biden administration is having to resort to, very strong messaging devices like this executive order, I frankly don't see why they shouldn't claim credit for the numbers going down over the last several months. And it's been very striking to hear essentially nothing from the Biden administration on that point.
Well, last year, the number of migrants at the border did hit record highs, and there is an increase of folks crossing illegally. But what does that mean? Is this a problem that's detrimental to American citizens, or is it more a political problem for Biden?
To me, it's very painful that in all of this, because of the politics, there's really no high-level American public official routinely touting the benefits and the meaning of immigration generally. And we're not really getting that from anyone. Instead, what we're getting is this sense of, the numbers are high, we're in crisis, we have to act. I think the fact that large numbers of people are showing up at the southern border, that there aren't resources to process them, it is a crisis. And there's a lot of kind of parsing of that word crisis. Is it a crisis? Is it a manufactured crisis? I think it would be news to people showing up at the southern border who have had to leave their homes seeking protection or opportunity here. It would be news to them that they're not living through a crisis. That reality is real. But I really think that it's important, particularly now in an election year, but of course always, to reinforce to people that immigration is a good thing, that immigrants are law-abiding, that they enrich communities, that they have helped prop up the economy. I mean, even if you were allergic to making a kind of moral-based argument for immigration, there are very commonsensical, pragmatic arguments you could make that I think would be tailor-made for an election year. So, for example, the fact that there are labor shortages across the country, and that you have even Republican governors of states like Utah and Indiana saying, look, without more immigrant labor, we have like a real job gap here. The economy after the COVID pandemic basically only recovered, and this is according to data from the Federal Reserve, because of the immigrant labor force.
Well, even if we say immigration is actually good for the United States, there seems to be a public perception that it's not. Why?
I think the numbers of people showing up at the southern border are really high. And that is a function of global conditions. It's a function of history. It's a function of gridlock in Washington. It's a function of all kinds of things. But I think that there is a misperception that under Biden and under Democrats, there is more chaos at the border than there was under Republicans. It needs to be said, the only thing that brought the numbers of arrivals at the southern border down under Trump, once his administration really got underway, was the COVID pandemic, which had nothing to do with U.S. border policy. It had to do with what the once in a century pandemic did to global movement. Take one of the most dramatic moments in the Trump administration, one of the most upsetting moments in the Trump administration, the child separation crisis in the summer of 2018, when the Trump administration, to try to discourage other asylum-seeking families from coming to the southern border, separated parents from their children at the border. What you saw in the months after that, and by the spring of 2019, were record numbers of people arriving at the border again. And so, that chaos existed under Trump as well, but people were seduced by the rhetoric he used into thinking that he was being tougher than everyone else, and that toughness translated into actual gains in policy. It did not. It really is incumbent on Biden and on the Democrats to make this point clear that, Republicans did not have answers where Democrats didn't. I think it's probably most accurate to say that no one really has answers for how to manage this situation in a kind of reasonable way. But it's certainly wrong to think that the Republicans did this better than the Democrats.
Thank you, Jonathan Blitzer, for coming on What Next?
Thanks so much for having me.
Jonathan Blitzer is a staff writer for The New Yorker. His latest book is Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here. That's the show. If you're a fan of What Next, the best way to support our work is to join Slate Plus. Go to slate.com/whatnextplus to sign up. What Next is produced by Paige, Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. We're led by Alicia Montgomery, with a little help from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary C. Curtis, columnist at Roll Call and host of its Equal Time podcast. Find me on Twitter. I'm at mcurtisnc3. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.